So to get us started, I want to hear from each of you. 2 sentences or less, how would you describe the experience of covering the criminal trial, the first criminal trial of a former president of the United States? Anna Bauer.
I'm going to give you one word, Natalie, which is exhausting. I am still not quite recovered from the lack of sleep over the past 5 to 6 weeks, but exhausting, historic, really fun. Those are my descriptions of what it was like.
Awesome. Tyler McBrien.
I think along that theme, definitely exhausting, but I had a blast. I know we're going to talk about the newness of it all, but I was recently re-listening to Slow Burn Season 1, and in the first episode, the host references this Dick Cavett interview where he talks about how he's very nostalgic for Watergate, and it was very serious and very intense, but he was very nostalgic and he missed it, and I feel like I'm already reaching the nostalgia phase. Again, serious thing we're covering, but I had a lot of fun.
Quinta Jurecic.
I will say it was weird. It was weird for a lot of reasons, but for me, I will say, I feel like I kind of come to this after more years than I would like to count covering Trump's legal problems. And so there was something very strange about actually seeing him in a courtroom. And also being in the courtroom with him, which I know to Anna is old hat and maybe not even worth commenting on. But for me was very odd, especially when he, rakes his gaze along the lines of journalists in the courtroom and stares at you. I think, Anna, you compared it to the Eye of Sauron. That was extremely disorienting. So it felt in some ways like a kind of culmination of a lot of work that I've been done, but in other ways, which we can talk about, I think there were plenty of things that I never would have predicted.
Benjamin Wittes.
I forget who it was who described warfare as long periods of boredom punctuated by moments of extreme terror. But that's kind of the way I felt about the Trump trial. It was long periods of listening to these document witnesses and, people who were in there to testify about how a phone was handled, punctuated by these moments of just extraordinary, David Pecker and Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen, and the most extraordinary moment of all, which was from Keith Davidson. I found it alternately extremely boring and just completely riveting.
I was going to add one more word, which is the New Yorkness of it all, which the accents were fantastic, the setting, the scene both inside and outside of the courtroom was just so New York and so wonderful in its own seedy, strange way. Ben Kochman, who's another journalist who was covering the trial from the New York Post, liked to say that this was a New York Post trial, not a New York Times trial, which I think really captures the essence of that.
That's great. I guess that actually leads well into one of the questions I was going to ask, which was, Anna, you've observed a couple of times since you have been at so much of the trial in Fulton County, where in Judge McAfee's court, there is actually video and anyone who wants can watch on YouTube. And you've talked in the past about what an impact that has on sort of the sense of public access. And of course, that was not the case here. There's no video allowed in the courtroom. And I'm just curious what sorts of differences you think that meant in terms of the distance between the experience of being there versus reading or listening to reporting on it after the fact. So Anna, let's start with you, and then I'm curious to hear others' views too.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit on the dispatch that we did the day that the guilty verdict came down, in which I talked about how, I think that this trial would have, and the kind of communicative value of the guilty verdict that was rendered by the jury would be more impactful to the public if it was the case that they actually could see this trial play out for themselves. Because a lot of what happened here, I think, is somewhat difficult to communicate, because even though you have journalists there who are trying to in real time give people information and news, there's always going to be some kind of gap in what was actually happening in real time, what it was like to see a person actually say the words that they're saying, and then, how people are receiving it on the written page, because that's what we're working in, is a written medium. And it was just very different seeing it in person and seeing it at its full scale for all the sliminess and sleaziness that was involved in this trial. Because I think that really is what came across day after day, is even if you ultimately came down on the side of thinking to yourself, I don't know if this is a correct or a proper use of prosecutorial discretion here, I think that what you couldn't deny is that Donald Trump and the people involved with him come out looking like slime balls. And so I think that's one of the big differences. And Natalie, it really made me appreciate, maybe for the first time in a real sense, when you think about in law school, when you're talking about the trial judge being the person that appellate courts look to as the evaluator of credibility on the stand, for example. There are different kind of ways that appellate courts look at a trial judge's factual findings, because they are the person who is sitting there watching a witness actually say the words they were saying. They're not just reading kind of, their transcript. They actually were able to evaluate that demeanor and credibility as it was happening. And so that's why appellate judges, defer to a trial judge's credibility findings in some sense. And here I really felt like I understood that very deeply, why that is something that in legal practice, I've just never really thought about it that much until this trial, where it really came. It seemed to me like there was a huge gap between the commentators who were on TV who were not at the trial, and then the people who were sitting there day in and day out.
Quinta, Tyler, Ben, any other thoughts on the sort of difference between being there and what people could perceive through reporting?
I will say I'm coming to this as someone who was most of the time not there, and was relying on the other three guests here to sort of be my eyes and ears, and then who went up for a couple of days instead of, so I felt like got to see, both methods of following the trial in action, so to speak. I will say, I think that thanks in large part to the really incredible sort of live tweeting that Anna and Tyler were doing, I felt like I was able to follow the case pretty closely. So some days I was basically locked in, and that was kind of what I was doing all day. When Stormy Daniels testified, for example, and when Michael Cohen testified, I'd sort of blocked out the day, and, from DC was, refreshing my million live blogs and refreshing Tyler and Anna's Twitter feeds like a madwoman, trying to keep up with what was going on. And I do feel like that ability to have some amount of sort of semi, at least live back and forth from the courtroom was really, really helpful, and kind of helped to some extent, if you were paying attention closely, which a lot of people didn't have the bandwidth to do, of course, capture a little bit of what was going on. That said, it's definitely true that, it felt different to be in the courtroom. I think you got a different feel for just the atmosphere, which in this case was really important because, it's the courthouse is not a super grand building. Tyler and I were talking about this earlier, that, it's like a municipal government building. It looks, if you went to the DMV, that's kind of what it's like. Like, the light is dim, the elevator has a bit of a Tower of Terror vibe, the bathroom, the sink taps don't totally work. It was always a little too cold or a little too warm. And I think that kind of really adds to the sort of bizarre atmospherics of the whole thing. on a more serious note, I also think that, so I was there for the testimony of the end of Michael Cohen's testimony, the testimony of the defense witness, Robert Costello, which was a real train crash, and then the charging conference. And it definitely did feel to me like you got a different sense of the sort of dynamics and personalities at play actually being in the courtroom than I did just watching from afar. In the case of Costello, there was a sort of blow up between him and Justice Merchan that was pretty alarming to see happening in front of me in the courtroom. I think I put my hand over my mouth at one point, full drama mode. It's also true that, I think it helped communicate to me, certain things that you all were writing in your daily dispatches were really not exaggerations. Like Todd Blanche really is that unbelievably irritating to listen to. Emile Beauvais is a delight on the other hand. And also helped communicate on the prosecution side sort of what the energy was on their side, which was very much, all business, we're white collar prosecutors, we're here to, get our man, no messing around on their end. And then on Justice Merchan's side, the fact that despite a lot of the comments made by the Trump camp, he was very measured, very quiet, spoke in a really, really soft voice most of the time, and just had a pretty striking amount of command over the courtroom, given what a circus it sometimes seemed to be about to turn into. And all of those things I think I had been kind of prepared for, thanks to the great reporting that you all had been doing, but didn't really fully understand until I was there.
Yeah, just to build off of that, I think I'm still spinning out the counterfactual in my head of whether it would have been better or how different it would have been had it been, at least the audio or live streamed or the video live streamed. But because it wasn't, as we've been talking about, I was very acutely aware the entire time of how warped and enlarged the role and responsibilities were of the press. And when I first got there, I thought it was actually kind of silly that there's such a this vast amount of journalistic resources being poured into this case, and there's all of these amazing journalists who are sitting watching the same thing, reporting the same thing. But I quickly realized how good of a thing that is, because the color in the courtroom, the way people say things, two people can look at it and have subjectively different opinions on someone's mood or tenor. Some of those are much closer calls than others, but sometimes I would see other journalists recollections of what was happening or in the moment and think we were looking at two different things when in fact we were looking at the same thing. So there I was also acutely aware of this just inevitability of things getting lost in translation. And it was really difficult to juggle, trying to stay objective as I can while pushing the narrative forward for people, while still realizing that I might be interpreting something differently than others. So all that is to say, I'm glad there was the amount of press who was there. But it's a shame that, because of these happy accidents of our life, like we were the ones who were there, the very few and very small fraction in the country.
That leads nicely into another thing I wanted to ask about, which is there were so many journalists there. I think it is safe to say that none of them is most typically reaching a very niche, often described as uber nerdy audience of people who are really interested in and eager to sort of get into the weeds of, in particular, the law. And that's just not the vantage point that a lot of reporters were coming from, understandably. So some people were looking more at the politics of it, trying to ascertain the jury's reactions to things. It seemed to me that we were doing things very differently. I have my own views, being the proud colleague and of all of you and the executive editor of the organization, on why we were indispensable and fantastic. But I do want to hear from those of you who were there, talking to reporters on the margins. What did you sort of see as what we were bringing to the table that was different or complementary to all of these other reporters who were there? Ben, I'm curious to hear from you on this first, actually.
Yeah, so look, I think broadly speaking, you can divide all the reporters who were there into four big categories. So one is the daily and wire service news organization people who are there essentially as chroniclers. And most of them were doing some form of live blogging or sometimes on specialized live blogging platforms on the site itself. Some of them are on Twitter, some are doing a combination, filing daily stories. But they are all essentially doing the same thing, which is covering it from a high altitude where their fundamental lens that they're looking at it through is what's the big thing that is happening or just happened. Then there are the magazine writers, some of them domestic and some of them foreign, who are trying to get a higher altitude portraiture of something. Either they're writing an opinion piece or they're writing something that's about the whole case rather than about any given moment of it. There are the ideological writers, many of them from the right, who are there to critique the proceedings or to cover it from a very specific critical point of view. And then there's us, and we were there with a different mission, which was to chronicle it with as much detail as humanly possible, and to do it for the people who, as Quinta described, wanted to be in the room but couldn't. And so they wanted the closest thing they could get to an effectively real-time transcript. So we did this in three forms, which was one, Tyler and Anna live blogged it, but live blogged it in much more detail than anybody else did. And this was done on Twitter. The second was that every 2 days of proceedings, we produced a dispatch, which was really a summary of, I thought of it as like, the transcript would be 200 pages. The dispatch would be 1/10 of that. So, you could get a really good sense of what happened, but not at the ground level, sort of at the 5,000-foot level. These were incredibly labor intensive to produce. It took generally all three of us and one other person to produce them, and they took a full day and a half separately from the proceedings. And then the third thing was the daily oral dispatches, which we did on both YouTube and the podcast. And the idea there was for the person who wants much more information than you're going to get from, even like a really fine news organization that's there, like even from NPR or the New York Times, right? You want a lot more information, much more of a summary, witness by witness, but you want it in a discrete period of time. We set sort of half an hour as our kind of limit. We were going to do half an hour a day. So this was half an hour in which you would get everything you needed from the day. Those were the three basic products that we did every day. And then we had Quinta and Roger, who were doing kind of, we thought of it as sort of, we were the trial team and they were the appellate team. They were kind of doing a look at issues that were coming up, which might require zooming in on some legal issue that we didn't have time to look at because we were in there covering the next iteration of the arguments and the presentation of evidence. But sometimes Tyler would step out and work on those as well. And so the idea was to have one group of people that were really doing the chronicling, and then one group of people that was boring in on issues that needed more attention, that we couldn't stop and pay all the attention to that we needed to.
And can I just add, too, that I think that one of the things that was really special about what we were doing here is that, you know, it's very rare to find a group of people who are devoted to both factual reporting and analytic coverage of legal proceedings. You typically see, especially in mainstream media, a divide between you have the people who are going in and reporting on the facts in the courtroom. Those are your kind of courts correspondence type people, but they don't necessarily have the tools or background or training to do actual legal analysis of what they're reporting on. And I think that what is special about Lawfare and what we've especially been doing with respect to our coverage of the Trump trials is that we're the unusual news or, you know, media organization that's actually able to do both, because we have people who are able to do analysis, because that is what we do at Lawfare. But then also we are there in the courts actually reporting on facts as well. And that blend, I think, is what is really unique about what we brought to the table in our coverage of this trial.
I have one small anecdote that can, I think, illustrate this dynamic. It was, I think, just before the charging conference, in which we were since in the lead up to the charging conference, we were all of us were really trying to get our hands on proposed jury instructions. We were lost during the charging conference when we didn't have them. And the journalist next to me before the charging conference, I asked this person whether they or their news outlet was able to get their hands on the proposed jury instructions or even the final ones, because by then it seemed that the judge had already, you know, finalized them. And I remember them saying, even if we did, it's so boring, I'm not going to read that anyway. And I was just like, I'm sorry, I can't relate. We've been banging our heads against the wall the past week, dying to get our hands on just a scrap of these jury instructions because we're huge nerds. And they're incredibly important, as I don't have to tell anyone on this call or anyone listening to this as well.
Yeah, I'll add one other thing that we did, which is our weekly roundup of all of Trump's trials, which I think added, and that's of course something we've been doing for months and months at this point, and New York became more prominent among the 4 different cases that we've been covering as the trial came about. But you know, having followed Todd Blanche, for example, who is Trump's attorney in multiple cases, I think we sort of brought a unique vantage point there as well. I want to come to the appellate team of Quinta Jurecic because I think, you know, I was looking back at the article that you and Tyler had written at some point many, many weeks ago, which I believe started along the lines of, you know, Lawfare nerds eager to get in the weeds, welcome everyone else who's, you know, Google panic searching as the jury instructions are going out. We're glad you joined us. So you were doing a ton of work to understand the law and start anticipating what the disputes were going to be around jury instructions, around what was complicated, what was necessary for the prosecution in proving its case. And it really was not a straightforward process. So I'm hoping you can just sort of talk through what that looked like and how you experienced it.
Honestly, I think the beginning of this process was just trying to understand what the legal theory behind the case was. That was kind of the first piece that I wrote in this series, such as it was, because there had been a great deal of confusion among commentators about how to understand the charges because of the structure of the charges. Everyone who's listening to this is probably familiar by now, but I'll just say it again just to get it on the record here. So Trump, of course, was convicted of 34 felony counts, the felony being first-degree falsification of business records. The way that you get to first-degree falsification of business records is that there is a misdemeanor business record falsification charge, and then that it becomes a felony when it's connected to the intent to commit, conceal, or aid in the commission of another crime, which is known as the object offense. And so there was a lot of conversation initially when this indictment was released about what on earth is this object offense? And it wasn't specified at the time. DA Alvin Bragg said in his press conference announcing the indictment, we actually don't have to specify this at this stage of proceedings under New York law. So there was a lot of sort of premature, let's say, I think, commentary on the strength of the legal theory before the theory itself actually became clearly explained. And I wanted to kind of lock down what we knew going into the trial. And so what I found is actually that if you looked at the briefing, specifically the briefing around a omnibus motion to dismiss that Trump filed, that Bragg set out answers to those questions in his opposition to the motion to dismiss, and that Justice Merchan addressed them, sometimes not in as much depth as nerds like us might have liked, but he did address them in his ruling on that motion to dismiss in early 2024. And so that sort of clarified what the different object offenses were. I won't go into the super granular details here, but I ended up writing an article that sort of charted out how all these different object offenses interacted. And I think crucially explained the object offense that eventually became the lead and ultimately the only object offense that the prosecution was focused on, which is this statute, a misdemeanor offense under New York election law, 17152. Which makes it unlawful to conspire to prevent or promote the election of a person by unlawful means. And I think having sketched that out in my mind and being able to, put it out on Lawfare and be able to point back to it was really useful, because there continued to be so much conversation about, what's the legal theory? We don't even know. You saw this after Trump was convicted, where a lot of commentators on the right went out there and said, essentially, we don't even know what he was convicted of, when this had all very much been on the table. And I think that having this as well also made it useful, made it easier for us to follow the details of the charging conference, even though we didn't actually have the proposed jury instructions in front of us, because we had a sense of kind of what the different legal issues were. The second piece in that was the piece that Tyler and I wrote, which you've already mentioned, which dove a little bit more into the sort of questions of how this structure of a felony that was built on top of an intent to commit or conceal this object offense, how that interacted with things like, what the jury had to agree on, what the prosecution had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And that, I think, showed up at the charging conference as well, turned out to be really important in the jury instructions. And so I will say I was lucky to be there for the charging conference, and as the lawyers were sort of hashing out these issues in front of the judge, did feel sort of very glad that we have been able to set this all out there in advance, hopefully to make it easier for people to follow. The last thing I wrote has to do with this question of why the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York chose ultimately not to pursue a case against Trump on federal election law on the basis of the same fact pattern that resulted in this New York indictment. I don't know if we want to go into the details of that here, but I will say that I think that digging into that was helpful in understanding sort of some of the background of this prosecution, and helps explain why some of the falsehoods that people have been spreading about it in terms of, this was unmerited, it never should have been brought, this is just an example of, the Biden DOJ trying to bring Trump down, why those don't really hold water if you take a closer look.
to say nothing of the fact that this was a state case and the Biden
Yes, there's
DOJ
also
doesn't
that.
have any control over it. Anna, Tyler, Ben, any other thoughts on how having the appellate team in place and having dug into the specifics of New York law and procedure changed the way that we were able to report on the case?
Well, I'd actually broaden it. I think it changed the way that a lot of other reporters reported on the case as well. Anna can probably also speak to this, but we heard quite a few times that other reporters look to Lawfare as a resource to explain a lot of the legal theory. And even I had to constantly remind myself of the legal theory as well. Even with regard to the one piece that I co-wrote with Quinta, I would often have a split screen on while I was live tweeting of Quinta's legal analysis series with my live tweets to make sure I was getting things right and pulling from that. So I think it helped me, but I think it helped reporters beyond Lawfare as well.
Anna or Ben, any other thoughts on that?
I will also say that I know that there's at least one other media organization beyond just our appellate, analysis work. There's at least one other media organization that actually focused on putting a lot of the primary source filings onto their website. That was Law 360, but before that, I think it was, and then also Just Security did as well. But I think, we were one of only a few organizations that really focused on putting this New York docket, replicating a New York docket, because there's not one that's really publicly accessible. And I heard from a lot of reporters that was very helpful to them as well.
Okay, so let's switch gears into some Lawfare color commentary. I happen to know from the very active Lawfare Slack channels that the logistics of covering this case, not so easy. Among the many other things, those of you who were there had to immediately after trial rush off to go back to our makeshift studio back at the apartment that we rented, rather than be able to sit, nicely framed with a light reflecting fancy thing and the satellite off of the mobile truck and your professional camera person beaming you out to all the world. So yeah, just tell us, maybe starting with you, Ben, since you were back and forth from New York every single week, tell us your favorite logistics story about a little nonprofit called Lawfare covering the historic presidential trial.
Yeah, so before I do that, I want to amplify a little bit your brief and somewhat joking account of the way a normal news organization does this, because you've actually buried a very important point. So let's take what one might call a real news organization, rather than a college paper masquerading as a news organization like us. So the networks, for example, they all had satellite trucks right outside of the court. They had a set of professional camera crews on site with permanent installations, so that people, and Anna and Tyler both did this, would walk out of court into their network setting, and somebody could put a little powder on their face, and there, for those of them who were reading off of teleprompters, there's a teleprompter there, and there's a preset shot with the court in the background and a live connection between that truck, which is driving that setup across the park, and the control room of the network in question. And if you're a major paper instead of a network, you have your local bureau, you have your support resources back home. So we don't have any of that. So if we're going to do a live stream, and remember, we're live streaming almost immediately when court ends, the rate limiting step being how quickly we can walk a 15-minute hop back to this apartment that we rented, we have to run all that tech ourselves, and we're dependent on the building that we rent from to have internet that was adequate, which it was not always. And we're kind of, running our own control room with some help from the Goat Rodeo folks and from Anna Hickey, who was actually our control room. And so it's very much, what you can do with off-the-shelf technology, and by the way, not the highest grade off-the-shelf technology, and off-the-shelf software and live streaming technologies that are very, that you're not really fully in control of yourself. And we have very little support. So, we don't have 100 interns to throw at a problem, or, you're sort of there and there's the group of you who were there. And then, the support resources that Natalie could spare on any given day from the day-to-day editorial production of Lawfare. And so those are the logistics. So the first decision that we made was that we couldn't easily do this out of hotel rooms because we needed to build a studio. That would mean that we would have to have an extra hotel room that was basically a studio. And so we rented an apartment, which we called the Hype House. And I guess my favorite logistics story is just the day that we realized that the Wi-Fi in the Hype House just wasn't good enough to have 3 people on Zoom at the same time. And so, we were trying to figure out, could we run one of them off of the iPhone? It was really, kind of both awesome and really embarrassing, just like how much we built this really great tech setup. And it's only as good as the Wi-Fi in the apartment. And the Wi-Fi in the apartment was just, it was this Cadillac thing on the back of a camel that just was not strong enough to carry the Cadillac. And so, we had a few bad days with tech, but by and large, we got it done.
I'll just say a quick word on the experience of also doing these daily recording dispatches. We would always joke, it's a long day in court. It's an early morning. You kind of emerge after the long day in a daze. And Anna and I would always joke as we're setting up that we had nothing to say. We're still processing everything because, as Ben said, we would record right after. And Ben would then reassure us and say, you're doing the best preparation anyone could ever do for this. You just sat through it for 8-9 hours. And then sure enough, the first question would come and these answers would just come pouring out. And then within 5 seconds, it felt like 30 minutes would go up. But still, every day it would happen like that. We would come out on days and we would be like, I have no idea what to say. I'm still thinking about it. I blacked out the past 8 hours, but sure enough, it came together.
But it was also a very fun experience. Everyone, kind of living together. I mean, I don't know if Quinta would agree, but we called the Hype House the nerd frat house because there was a point where we were working so much that there were just kind of things like strewn about the apartment, like random cords and Quinta when
at one point the Goat Rodeo people came to fix the tech, and no offense to the great Noam Osband, who is recording this podcast, but they did a great job fixing all the tech, and they left all the packing material on the floor of and so it really looked like, a bunch of like frat boys had showed up and unpacked a lot of audio.
Yeah, I will just say that on the train up, Anna texted me to say, just so you know, it looks a little bit like a frat house. And Ben, who was sitting on the train across from me, said, no, it doesn't.
Ben was like, it's not that bad. And then Quinta shows up and she goes, this really is like a frat house. So it was very fun because, like, you know, we'd rush back. My favorite part was always when I'd be like standing in front of the bathroom mirror putting powder on my nose because, you know, we'd been in court all day and like you kind of get sweaty and all that. And so I'd be powdering my nose and Tyler'd be standing there in the doorway, like talking to me of like, okay, let's analyze like what happened during the trial, and we'd kind of be doing a pre-chat about what we thought about things, and it was all just kind of a little family atmosphere in terms of the living situation, and it actually made things really fun, and I think creatively like kind of helped us like in terms of running ideas by each other and working together, and so it was a fun time.
Okay, I can't believe none of you has done some unsolicited advertising for the line guys yet.
Oh, the line dudes! Yes, they saved our, because like, look, we were working extremely hard. And a lot of it was things that people just would not see because people were either following our live tweets or they were reading our dispatches or they were listening to the dispatches, or they were seeing us on TV when we do TV hits or whatever. But, you know, all of it combined meant that at many times, especially because Ben's also running Lawfare still as the editor-in-chief, Tyler's the managing editor, you know, we all had these other things that were going on top of just our primary trial coverage. So we were working 16 to 18 hours a day in some instances, and the line dudes were the people who saved us from actually, you know, like having, you know, we were able to get sleep as a result. So shout out to the same old line dudes because it was really helpful to have a reliable a person to be able to wait in line for us whenever we needed to. But we still had a lot of really early mornings. We often had to be there, you know, 6 something in the morning, and so a big part of this work just was waiting in line.
I mentioned this before, but I didn't have the text at my disposal. But I think this also illustrates how that they're consummate professionals. This was at 4:46 p.m. Thursday, May 30th, seconds maybe after they read the guilty verdict. We had booked a line sitter that night thinking that we would have to return on Friday for further deliberation, and this is the text I got at 4:46. Verdict reached. If you paid already, it will be refunded by 9 p.m. tonight. Thank you for your business. Please keep us in mind for Sean Combs, Harvey Weinstein, Apple, Hunter Biden, and even Trump's DC trial. Whenever that happens, all caps, yes, we travel. It's been an honor and a privilege to serve you all. Robert Samuel for #LineDudes. Amazing.
I love that combination of people. So Donald Trump, Sean Combs, Harvey Weinstein, Hunter Biden.
Anybody there's a lineup for to cover.
But we should also give a shout out, if we're going to shout out the line dudes, gotta say the New York courts officers who manage the lines. We already gave a shout out to Officer Zarate, but there were many more who were just truly excellent professionals who managed things in the best way possible, really just great. And so thank you to all of the law enforcement officers who made that possible and made it relatively, you know, nice for all of the media reporters who were dealing with this otherwise very chaotic situation. And Al Baker, who is the press liaison, I think really cared about making things equitable so that organizations like Lawfare, which would probably, like, you know, I've been covering this stuff for 2 years, and very often it's a fight for us to get into the room with all of these other legacy organizations that have, you know, the fancy lawyers and the kind of embedded local reporters in these courthouses. And I think that Al really cared about making sure that there was a diversity of media organizations. And so we're very lucky that that was the case here.
Memo to the court in Fort Pierce.
Exactly.
The only thing I'll say is that I've heard that the New York, the First Division of the Appellate Department has a really cool looking courtroom with like...
They do.
stained
where I was,
glass and gold and murals. So we have something
yeah,
to
they
look
have a
forward to.
ceremonial courtroom. I don't know if they would hold it there, though. That's just the ceremonial one. That's where I was sworn into the bar. I will say, in the months leading up to this, I think there were some genuine concerns that things might get, tense or even scary down at the courthouse, because it's, we're the country where January 6th happened a couple of years ago, and that was really unimaginable at the time. We knew that this was going to be really, really controversial. So I think the NYPD and the court officers must have done a lot behind the scenes too, to make sure that the entire environment was safe, even leading up to the great work they did on the ground over the course of those weeks.
They had a lot of protesters, some of them quite rowdy, of a real diversity of viewpoint and orientation. One of the first days we were there, a whole bunch of people marched through singing, "No one is above the law, no one is above the law." And then there were, the pro-Trump protesters who showed up with all kinds of gizmos. And then there were just the oddballs. The last day, one of the last days, a quite violently anti-Semitic protester showed up to taunt the line, and a bunch of people in the line, particularly Andrew Giuliani, decided it was a good idea to engage him. And, so there were, I didn't see anything that I thought was really dangerous, but there were a lot of things that were not potentially, escalatory or explosive, and just keeping the pro-Trump protesters in the pro-Trump section and the anti-Trump protesters a little bit away from them. I mean, that stuff actually takes good policing, and if you don't do it well, you end up with fistfights and stuff. And so I thought the whole thing was run very effectively and without imposition on anybody's civil rights and civil liberties. And I just thought it was very well handled all around, including, by the way, by the protesters who were, not throwing punches at each other.
One word on the protesters. I think maybe also Quinta's favorite protester. There was one extremely well-informed protester who had a huge sign that said, "Why won't Blanche let Schiller testify?" Which is just such a great, deep cut. And then there was also one other protester who was shouting at the line, "Representative Richie Torres also violated New York Statute 17-152, which is also so specific. I don't know the merits of that at all, but just these very well-informed protesters.
Okay, well, while we're talking about our favorite protest moments, mine was Tyler and I were walking around in a section where there were a lot of pro-Trump supporters, and they're yelling and chanting as reporters are milling about, fake news, fake news. But then as they're yelling this, they're walking up to an ABC News camera to give interviews to ABC News while chanting at them that they are fake news. So we were kind of okay, so fake news, but please let me go on your, TV show. And then I walked over and saw this cute little dog, and I was talking to the guy, and I said, "Oh, can I pet your dog?" And he said, "Sure." And then I go, "Oh, what's her name?" And he goes, just looks at me straight, no sense of joking about it. And he just looks at me and he goes, "Anarchy is her name." And so I was just sitting there petting this little cute dog named Anarchy. Anyway, so yeah, that was my favorite moment of the protesters.
So I think we will leave it there. But I will say, on behalf of those of us on Lawfare who were not there, your work was really excellent. I was really, not to be mushy, but I was very proud of it. So congratulations and thank you.